Hello, everybody. So, we recently did a video about highly successful owner operators and networking with other highly successful owner operators, and you may know people who are millionaires, and you may be on the path of becoming a millionaire, and you're like, okay, what's next for the for those guys who are successful? They're always thinking like, what's next? What's next in my career? What else can I do? I've already achieved success. What comes next after you achieve success? Well, I suggest you focus on longevity. So I'm out here for my walk. I try to walk regularly throughout the course of the week. Not not necessarily every day. If I could, I would every day, but that's not always possible. But 2, 3 times a week, I'll get out of the truck and I'll walk. I'll walk 5 miles at a time, maybe a little bit more. And what these guys do that look at longevity is, they're just trying to stay healthy. Once you are approaching 60 years old, then your priorities change. It's not so much about ambition or career or making a lot of money. For these guys, it's about longevity. How many more years can you keep driving before you're going to be forced to retire? That's what they're really trying to achieve. Because these guys who are successful don't necessarily want to retire. They may still be relatively young, and although they can afford to retire, they they may not want to retire. Now, that being said, they may cut back on the amount of driving they're doing, but they still want to drive. you'll see you'll see guys in their 70s who are still driving. They don't have to be driving. For the most part, they're doing it because they want to, not because they have to. And how do you achieve longevity is you gotta do everything you can to be healthy, diet and exercise. We all know sitting in the truck for 8 to 10 hours a day, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good for your health. So these guys who are successful, they include the aspect of their performance would be to maintain health and fitness as much as they can. You're not going to be able to run a marathon, not going to be able to do 100 push-ups or sit-ups, but get out and do 5 miles walking. That's fine. That's all they need, and they can keep driving, something they have a passion for. These guys are already successful. They don't need they don't need more money. They'll take it, sure, everybody would take it, but they don't have to go out there and kill themselves to try to make it. They've already made it. So it's like you're thinking about your career, and you're like, okay, I can see where I'm going to be 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now. You could see your own success. It's just a matter of time. You know what your savings rate is. You know how your investments are performing. You can project with reasonable certainty that you're going to be doing just fine in years to come. So what is the big challenge after that? Once you have all the experience you need as an owner operator, it's like you don't need anybody's help for breakdowns. You don't need anybody's help for maintenance. You don't need anybody's help for anything to run your business, because you can do it all on your own. You don't need to network with other people. I mean, you do because you want to, but you don't have to. By and large, you've already achieved success. So now what? Now what are you going to do? You going to retire? These guys aren't going to retire. Now they're focused on their own longevity. Their priorities is like maintaining their health, being able to pass DOT physicals, taking time off, getting some R&R, rest and relaxation, Stop, smell the roses occasionally. These guys are at the top of their game. They learned everything they needed to learn. They got enough experience. They've experienced enough to be, at a master's level of their business. When you look at all the owner operators out there, the guys with 10 to 20 years experience have already mastered the body of knowledge. They've already had multiple trucks. They're just repeating, for the most part, they're repeating the process year over year over year. And you're like, okay, what is going to keep these guys motivated? What are they focused on if they've already achieved all these great things in their career? Well, the really good ones are going to focus on longevity. How long can they keep doing it? You really got to tip your hat off to these guys who are in their 70s, still driving truck. They found a way in their career to stay healthy enough to keep driving. Why would they want to give that up? They spent 20, 30 years developing a master level skill set. They're at the top of their game. Why would they want to stay home and sit in a reclining chair? I talked to many guys who retired and they hate it. They absolutely hate retirement. It may sound strange, but some guys enjoy working. It's not necessarily, I won't say it's easy, but they'd rather be at work than be at home. So they have more life fulfillment through their work than they do staying at home. If you've ever experienced long-term long-term unemployment, like maybe during the housing crisis, for example, the great financial recession of 2008, millions and millions of people were laid off and out of work. They were at home. Being at home is it's nice at first. It's something that you enjoy for about 6 months, and after that you're bored because you've done everything you wanted to do within the first 6 months, and after that you run out of things to do, and it no longer is as rewarding as you think it is. A lot of times you'll hear drivers talk about their plans when they're going to retire. They've been thinking about their plans for retirement for years, what they're going to do when they retire. And I've talked to many guys, because I'm in that age group where guys are starting to retire, and or they have already retired, and their advice to me was, don't retire. If you enjoy what you're doing, keep doing it. Because being retired is like being long-term unemployed. It's not really that much fun. I think you need to get out and amongst other people and be active. If you're stuck inside the house all day, staring at them four walls, that's not necessarily the best thing for you. I think you need to be more interactive and social than that. So you've achieved success, you've mastered the level of expertise you needed to as an owner operator, and you're wondering, okay, what do I do after that? I suggest you focus on your health, your diet, and your longevity. Now that you've gotten to this level, all the hard stuff is behind you. Learning to become an owner operator is quite the challenge, and it takes years for guys to develop. They could be great drivers, but no matter how great you are, it's still going to take several years to develop your skill set, your knowledge base, your expertise. Even if you are a top-notch individual, it's still going to take time to master the trade. You can't necessarily shortcut it and say, okay, I'm going to become a master level owner operator in 3 years. That's just unrealistic. That's not going to happen. No matter how much you want to, that's not going to happen. So all the hard stuff you do your first 10 years. You learn how to buy and sell trucks, you learn how to negotiate, you learn how to deal with breakdowns, you learn how to do maintenance, you learn how to make a profit, you learn how to save your money, and you learn how to invest it, you learn how to build and maintain a high credit score. You do all these things in your first 10 years. And then after that, you can really start enjoying it all, because it becomes somewhat just a repetition of things you've already learned. And then what do you do now? What's your next challenge? Because a lot of guys who are successful like challenges. They're always looking for the next thing. They always want something to sink their teeth in. They like it to be hard. They don't want it to be easy. They like being challenged. And I suggest that at that point, when you feel you've reached 10 years or more experience, you're on top of the game, you're looking for your next challenge. Your next challenge is focus on you, your physical well-being, your ability to have longevity, your ability to keep driving as long as you want to drive. Maybe you want to retire, maybe you don't, but if you have longevity, at least you'll have that choice. You don't want to be forced into retirement because you're unable physically to keep going. That would be unfortunate, especially if you really enjoy it. You don't want to be able not be able to pass the DOT physical. So when you're looking for that challenge, what's next? What do you do after you've achieved success? Then you start focusing on longevity, and it's a different type of challenge. You're on a different stage of your career. The hard stuff is behind you. Now you can focus on trying to be in the best health you can. You probably should be doing this all along, but if you haven't already, now's the time to do it. A lot of times, if you don't maintain your health in your 40s, your 30s and 40s, if you don't maintain your health when you're young, it's going to be too late when you get older. The damage is already done. You can't go back and correct it. So you should be maintaining your health all along. Even if you're young, you should still try to maintain your health. Once you get into your 50s and you get into your 60s, all that hard work you put in when you were younger is going to pay off. But if you neglected your health in 30s and 40s, now you're going to pay for it in your 50s and 60s. So I would suggest that those guys who haven't already, focused on their longevity, now's the time as good as any. If you want to keep going well into your years beyond, Social Security age, you want to keep driving to your 70, 75, maybe 80, you got to focus on your longevity. And now's the time to do it. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.